Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. We are going to begin with general questions, and our first question is from Angus MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government what percentage of businesses and domestic properties in the Falkirk East constituency can access superfast broadband and what percentage are connected.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Independent broadband analysis site Think Broadband states that 96.6% of all premises in the Falkirk Council area are able to access superfast broadband speeds of 30 megabits per second or better. The latest Ofcom figures from December 2018 for the Falkirk East constituency show that 89% of all small and medium-sized enterprise premises and 96% of domestic premises have access to superfast broadband of 30 megabits per second and above. And Ofcom figures also suggest that 62% of all lines in the Falkirk Council area have an active fixed broadband connection in excess of 30 megabits per second. This information is not available at the constituency level.
Angus MacDonald.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Scottish Government deserves full credit for providing superfast broadband to communities who would have fallen behind had it been left to the UK Government to get their act together. Despite this success, however, rural communities within my constituency, particularly in Avon Bridge, have faced severe delays and are still without access to the superfast network. Around 12 properties face the prospect of having to wait for R100, including businesses reliant on the best broadband available, having originally been advised that superfast broadband would be available to them some 2 years ago or more. These issues have been compounded by a lack of communication from contractors, misinformation from project literature and websites causing frustration, confusion and anger in these communities who feel they have been left high and dry while other communities very close by surge into the digital future. Can the Minister therefore provide reassurance that R100 will learn from the issues faced in rolling out the DSSB programme, ensuring that better, more effective community engagement is at the heart of the R100 programme?
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Well, firstly, could I recognise, especially given the applause from the Conservative benches, that broadband matters, as are all telecoms, are actually reserved to the UK ministers. But as Mr MacDonald knows, we are very much recognising that. Indeed, the member wants to ask a question in this Parliament, I'll certainly answer it. But Mr MacDonald will recognise that the issues that he raises in respect of his constituents are ones we very much acknowledge, and we are certainly unhappy to hear that members of Mr MacDonald's constituency have been led to believe they're going to get superfast broadband and haven't had that. Now, there are a number of complexities around the interaction between the commercial investment plans of operators and the public-sponsored projects such as DSSB, which we are very proud of, in terms of those state interventions such as the Scottish Digital Scotland Superfast Broadband Programme not being able to intervene where there's commercial plans. And that means there's some interaction between the two programmes, if you like, commercial investment and the publicly funded investment, and that can present some difficulties in understanding exactly which properties are going to be covered. But as the member knows, we have committed to a £600 million programme under R100, which I hope will deal with the properties in Mr MacDonald's constituency. But if you would like to let me know which ones they are, I can give a more definitive answer. But I do reassure him we have learned very much from the DSSB process and are trying to avoid some of the communication difficulties he describes, and make sure that we are work very much from the start of R100 to try and give as much clarity as we can to communities about when services will be delivered in their area.
Question number 2, Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it has taken to raise awareness of the Apologies Scotland Act 2016 since it came into force on the 19th of June 2017.
Minister Ash Denham.
The Scottish Government expect public bodies and other organisations to be aware of the current legislative framework and to update their procedures and guidance accordingly. The Scottish Government did not commit to issuing general guidance on the basis that to do so would risk interpreting the law, and that is obviously the job of the courts. Given that the Act is not retrospective and applies only to legal proceedings commenced after the 19th of June 2017, it may be premature to look for any practical content that courts may have added to the legislation.
Margaret Mitchell.
I thank the Minister for that reply. Will she consider launching an information media campaign, possibly to be done using the government's digital presence, Facebook, etc., targeted at solicitors, local government, businesses and the general public to raise awareness about the Act? And if so, will she initiate research on the uptake before and after the campaign to establish its effectiveness?
Minister.
I thank the Minister for raising that point, and I can see, the member for raising that point, and I can see that where the member is driving with that is more of a guidance of more of a general nature rather than of a, particularly of a legal nature. So the Scottish Government are working closely with the Interaction Action Plan Review Group, and it's anticipated that they will consider reparations including apology, acknowledgement, support and commemoration this year and next. And that is likely to include consideration of how information about the Apologies Scotland Act 2016 and its benefits can best be communicated. I will take the member's point about a media campaign and so on, and I will look at that and I will come back to the member once I've considered it. Thank you.
And question number 3, Ross Greer.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the comments in its China engagement strategy regarding respect for human rights and the rule of law, what discussions it has had with the Chinese consulate regarding the recent protests in Hong Kong?
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
The recent protests show the strength of feeling among the people of Hong Kong who have exercised their rights to freedom of speech and assembly as guaranteed in the Joint Declaration. The Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation discussed the protests in Hong Kong with the Chinese Consul General at a recent engagement. He has since written to the Consul General outlining the Scottish Government's position that it is vital that Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and the rights and freedoms set down in the Sino-British Joint Declaration are respected in full.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's remarks and the fact that a Scottish Government Minister has engaged with the Chinese consulate on this. 2 million people out of a population of 7 million in Hong Kong came out to protest and were yet again met with batons and tear gas by their own police force. That tear gas was manufactured by a company called Chemring, based in the UK, and in receipt of hundreds of thousands of pounds of money in enterprise grants from the Scottish Government. Given that the First Minister has previously confirmed in this chamber that the Scottish Government is interested in helping arms dealers transition into what was described as the blue light sector, i.e. the equipping of police forces, could the Cabinet Secretary confirm if funding the companies that are arming police forces like those in Hong Kong is part of what the Government had in mind, and if so, how on earth that's compatible with this Government's commitment to human rights?
Cabinet Secretary.
The plant at Stevenson does not produce tear gas. A grant of £160,000 was given to Chemring in 2013 to help modernise the company's site at Stevenson in North Ayrshire, helping to secure 13 permanent full-time jobs at the site.
Question number 4, Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what progress has been made with the inquiry into the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
Since their appointment, the co-chairs of the independent review have consulted extensively with experts and established systems for stakeholder contact. In line with the Britain Report recommendations, at a meeting today, they will publicly present the preliminary terms of reference and ask for feedback, and they will consult on those. They will also formally seek submissions of evidence and launch the review's website and contact details. This is all important because it is critical that a wide range of views and information is considered.
Michelle Ballantyne.
I thank that Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but given that on the 9th of July next month, the Royal Sick Kids in Edinburgh is due to open, and given that it shares the same design concept and is being built by the same contractors, can the Cabinet Secretary tell me if she has received assurance that the same issues will not be experienced?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, as Ms Ballantyne, I'm sure will know, it's certainly a reply I've given before in this chamber. NHS Lothian for the Royal Sick Kids in Edinburgh and other boards where we have new buildings, for example, in Orkney, were all tasked with making sure that they had the proper assurance from the immediate lessons that we had learned with respect to Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in terms of air ventilation and water supply and the use of, for example, sinks, that they had applied that in terms of the design and the construction. We have that assurance, and indeed that was one part of the reason why NHS Lothian did not take ownership of the site until it was absolutely assured that those steps had been put in place.
And Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is one of Europe's largest, with 1,100 patient rooms, 14 floors high and built on the site of the Southern General. Why is that acceptable for Glasgow, but not acceptable for our hospital in Monklands, which the Cabinet Secretary has just slapped a closed order on this morning?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, what a pity that Ms Smith didn't actually read the answer to that GIQ that was issued this morning. I have not slapped a closed order on Monklands Hospital. What I have repeated is this government's commitment, absolute commitment, to source a replacement for Monklands Hospital. What I have ruled out is making that replacement on the current site for a number of reasons set out in that GIQ, but let me give you some of them. There is no room around the existing hospital to build a new hospital. To build a new hospital on that site would require the demolition of the current hospital. The current hospital's capacity could not be picked up in the rest of Lanarkshire, therefore patients would wait longer for the treatment they need. I'm sure if that happened, Ms Smith would be first on her feet to criticise that. There is also an issue of patient safety if you construct a new build alongside an operating hospital with that proximity. So that is the case. What I have done is required NHS Lanarkshire to ensure that their consultation on a range of options, including making sure that new options that maybe have come forward in the most recent period are included, that consultation is from the very beginning one that involves the local communities that the Monklands Hospital serves, that ensures that the design that the clinicians have so well led for a new hospital continues to be applied in any new build, and that they take forward all of this with some speed, but making sure that the local communities' voices are well heard and they are part of the decision making before it comes to me. Those are the facts, Presiding Officer, and yet again I would appreciate if Scottish Labour would stick to the facts instead of making it up as they go along.
Question number 5, Willie Coffey.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to maintain Scotland's participation in the European digital single market, which is estimated to be worth €400 billion, in light of the UK Government's reported intention to withdraw from it.
Minister Kate Forbes.
Well, I recognise the value of access to the digital single market, with tech already a fast-growing sector in Scotland. It would be a deep shame that Scotland misses out on the emerging opportunities of being part of the European single digital market, and Brexit will have a detrimental impact on Scotland's digital businesses as they face increasing trade costs if UK and EU legislation diverge.
Willie Coffey.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? Presiding Officer, the situation with the digital single market, it's akin to a luxury €400 billion cruise liner sailing off into the sunset, and the UK sitting in a tugboat at the jetty wondering whether to try and follow it or not. One minute the UK was fully behind in leading this plan, and the next we're waving goodbye to it, to the horror of IT companies right across Europe. If we don't follow, then roaming charges will be back, shared digital services and access to IT procurement contracts will be seriously restricted. Can the Minister give us some assurance that Scotland's reputation for world-class IT innovation and developments will be protected, and that we will seek to maintain our links with Europe as this market develops in the future?
Minister Kate Forbes.
Well, that is why the Scottish Government put forward a comprehensive set of positions for us to remain part of the digital single market. We've engaged with the governments across EU member states, and despite Mr Hunt's recent interventions, we'll continue to engage strategically with our European partners. And as Scots head off on holiday, and perhaps some people in this chamber as well, to EU countries, we will benefit from surcharge-free roaming. In a no-deal scenario, that would no longer be guaranteed. So we cannot have an outcome of EU exit that puts Scottish citizens and businesses at a disadvantage, as we are just beginning to reap the benefits of a fast-growing tech sector.
Question 6, Colin Beattie.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on SEPA classifying the seawater at Fisherow and Musselburgh as poor in 2018-19, and the potential impact that this has on tourism and the health of people bathing in the area.
Cabinet Secretary Rosanna Cunningham.
The Scottish Government recognises the importance of good bathing water quality for bathing and tourism, and any poor classification is unacceptable and must improve. Together with SEPA and Scottish Water, the Scottish Government is taking all possible steps to raise bathing water quality, and this includes public sewer network improvements and fixing property misconnections.
Colin Beattie.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. What further specifically can the Scottish Government do to help East Lothian Council manage this situation, and is there a time frame to completion?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Scottish Government has provided £340,000 to fund a joint programme of intense sewer investigation for Fisherow and Portobello to identify and fix sources of pollution from property misconnections. Scottish Water is also currently carrying out improvements to the sewer network. The Scottish Government and SEPA provide support for East Lothian Council through the Edinburgh and Lothians Bathing Waters Stakeholder Partnership Group, and the government-funded Keep Scotland Beautiful, My Beach, Your Beach initiative provides support to East Lothian Council to reduce the impact from litter, dogs and gulls on Fisheroy sands.
Question number 7, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to tackle animal cruelty.
Minister Marie Goujon.
The Scottish Government is committed to the highest possible animal welfare standards, and we're taking forward legislation on animal sanctuaries and the breeding and sale of dogs, cats and rabbits, and licensing of pet shops. We expect to announce in September the timing of that legislation to increase the penalties for cruelty offences and to allow animals seized to protect their welfare to be quickly rehomed. We're planning a follow-up public awareness campaign on the risks of buying puppies, and we're also working to establish an Animal Welfare Commission to provide expert advice on future issues.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Minister for her answer, and the Minister will be aware of the increasing calls indeed for a 5-year maximum sentence to be available for the most serious cases of animal cruelty as opposed to the current maximum of 12 months. Can the Minister confirm that she is indeed sympathetic to those calls, and that in the legislation that she is referring to, that will be a provision that will be part of that bill?
Minister Marie Goujon.
I can confirm that, because the proposals for increasing the maximum sentence for the worst cases of animal cruelty, including the attacks on service animals, were consulted on as part of the Scottish Government's commitment to amend the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2006. Now, we published the responses to that consultation on the 10th of May, and the analysis of those responses will soon be published as well. And we expect to be able to make an announcement about the timing of that legislation in the programme for government in September.
Question number 8, Peter Chapman.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the use of patrol boats at Rockall in response to Irish fishing vessels.
Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop.
Marine Scotland continues to monitor and gather evidence regarding fishing activity at Rockall. However, we do not discuss specific details on the deployment of surveillance assets. Our aim is to resolve this issue through discussions with the Irish Government.
Peter Chapman.
I thank the Minister for that answer, but I'm disappointed by it. We have seen a major increase in Irish fishing vessels within the 12-mile limit around Rockall, from 15 incursions in 2014 to 94 in 2017. And even 2 Irish international maritime law experts agree this is illegal and should be stopped. What enforcement action has been taken? Have any Irish vessels been boarded and checked? And if not, why not?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I said, we continue to monitor the situation. I'm not going to discuss the specifics of deployment of surveillance assets, but it is important that we address this issue, as we have been doing for some time. And indeed, the figures that he has quoted are the figures that I proactively gave this chamber when I answered a previous question.
Question number 9, Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what analysis the Transport Secretary has carried out regarding how the proposed workplace parking levy could affect disabled people access and employment.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government has not carried out this analysis. The Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee agreed John Finney MSP's amendments to the Transport Scotland Bill on workplace parking levies on 19th of June. These amendments include a national exemption for blue badge holders and a requirement for any local authorities that choose to develop a workplace parking levy proposal to carry out impact assessments.
Jeremy Balfour.
Can I thank the Minister for his answer, but would you recognise that many disabled people do not have blue badges? They have hidden disabilities, they have upper limb disabilities, and they will be included in this tax. Will he stop and look again before this bad piece of legislation is passed?
Minister.
Well, I certainly recognise Mr Balfour's concern, but we encourage people who think they're eligible to apply for a blue badge to do so, and I certainly encourage members to encourage that to do. But secondly, the charge is levied on the occupier, not individuals parking, and therefore be for the employer to consider the needs of its employees. And this is one of the variables in developing a scheme that would be obviously the decision of the local authority to take forward, and that they undertake an impact assessment to make sure they are taking account of the needs of disabled customers.
Question 10, Adam Tompkins.
To ask the Scottish Government when it last discussed maintenance of the Clyde Tunnel with Glasgow City Council.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Excuse me, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, Michael Matheson MSP, met with Glasgow City Council on the 11th of June to discuss a number of transportation issues affecting Glasgow, including the maintenance of the Clyde Tunnel and its approaches.
Adam Tompkins.
Thank the Minister for that answer. The Clyde Tunnel faces an annual funding shortfall of some £775,000. Major structural work is required to keep the tunnel open, which is used by 64,000 vehicles every day. What support is Transport Scotland offering to Glasgow City Council to ensure that the Clyde Tunnel remains open and is safe?
Minister.
I very much recognise, Presiding Officer's strong interest in this issue. The Clyde Tunnel and its approaches form part of the local road network, and as such, responsibility for maintenance rests with Glasgow City Council. However, the Cabinet Secretary has instructed his officials at Transport Scotland to work with Glasgow City Council to explore the issues and costs associated with maintaining this important section of road.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. We're going to turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If a convicted criminal wearing an electronic tag removes it in order to wander the streets undetected, shouldn't that automatically be regarded as a crime?
First Minister.
Well, of course, I, like Ruth Davidson, was in the chamber when these issues were discussed at stage 3 of the bill earlier this week, and I thought there was a very good discussion on that. Many members made the point that
For example, if tags were removed for medical reasons, then perhaps no. But the bill, of course, includes a new offence of being unlawfully at large. And given Ruth Davidson's previous interventions on this issue, I would have thought that was something she welcomed. What we have seen this week through the bill, through what was approved by Parliament last night on the presumption against short sentences, is this government introducing reforms to the justice system that will make our country safer, because it's about smarter justice, and it's exactly the kind of reforms that her colleagues south of the border are pursuing themselves. So perhaps it's Ruth Davidson that is somewhat out of line here.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, let's just spell out what exactly happened under this government's new Management of Offenders Act, the one about which she talks. The SNP says it wants to start emptying the jails and let lots of people who would have been in prison out on the street wearing tags instead. That is what you said. Now, in my view, taking that tag off is therefore equivalent of scaling the walls and making a run for it, because but for that tag, you would be in a cell. And yet, under the SNP, all that will happen under this new system is you get sent a letter asking if you wouldn't mind turning yourself in, please. Cutting off your tag is not an automatic crime, and there is no extra penalty added to your sentence. Does the First Minister think this sounds like justice to most people?
First Minister.
Well, if it was correct, Ruth Davidson might have a point, but it is not correct. It is worth pointing out, firstly, that there is already, even before the Act was passed this week, consequences for people who tamper with electronic tags. If a person on home detention curfew tampers with a tag, that is immediately reported back to prison, and the person will be recalled back to custody. The steps that we took in this bill to bolster the law specifically create a new offence of remaining unlawfully at large for those who don't return to custody once recalled. And that approach gives the police more powers to apprehend prisoners who are considered to be unlawfully at large, including where they have tampered with their electronic tag. So precisely the changes to the law that people have been asking for, the problems, indeed, as I hear the Justice Secretary say, that Ruth Davidson called for, the proposals that came from the Tories this week did not have robust provisions around them. So, for example, somebody who damaged a tag in the course of employment or carrying out sporting activities would have been committing an offence with no appropriate defence in law. So what we've done is put in place robust and appropriate provisions. That's why they have been widely welcomed. And I would say, lastly, the whole premise of Ruth Davidson's questions around justice and law and order seem to be based on this view that somehow in Scotland we have a soft-on crime approach. Nothing could be further from the truth. I would ask Ruth Davidson to reflect on the fact that right now Scotland has the highest prison population in Western Europe. It's not the problem that we don't send enough people to prison. The problem is we're not smart enough in terms of the justice interventions. And the proposals we've taken forward this week, as I said a moment ago, are proposals that her colleagues in Westminster are looking at and emulating. So perhaps Ruth Davidson should reflect on the fact that it is her that is out of line on these matters.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, what I asked the First Minister was whether it sounded like justice to her. And here's the people who it doesn't sound like justice to. Scottish Women's Aid. They say to be a credible deterrent, breach of the electronic monitoring condition must be an automatic criminal offence. Victim Support Scotland. They say breaches of a tag must be punished to maintain the trust of victims in the community, because, they add, communities have no faith in community sentencing, because it takes too long for someone to be found to be in breach of their order. The SNP could have fixed this by making the breach of a tag a specific offence that was punishable by a sentence. Was it just because it was a Tory suggestion that the First Minister refused to do it?
First Minister.
No, it was because it was not the right approach. That's why we didn't follow that. That's why instead we put into the law a workable provision that will make a difference and actually deal with the problem that people have identified. So if somebody tampers with an electronic tag, if they are unlawfully at large because of that, then we have created a specific new offence to deal with that. Ruth Davidson's proposals, the ones that her colleagues brought forward, would have meant that if somebody accidentally
hampered their tag, that would have been an offence and there would have been no defence in law. So we've put in place a workable provision that makes sense, and perhaps it's the fact it makes sense that left the Tories unable to support it this week in Parliament.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, our proposal made sense for Scottish Women's Aid. They made sense for Victim Support Scotland. But let's talk about this unlawfully at large issue that the First Minister has been waving around here as a defence. Presiding Officer, it is 2 years since father of 3 Craig McClelland was stabbed to death by James Wright, a criminal who was unlawfully at large for 6 months after tampering with his electronic tag. This week, Mr McClelland's father Michael said this: why was James Wright out on a tag? How did he get it off, and why wasn't he lifted? Where was the system when my son was murdered, and why won't they answer these questions? First Minister, what are you going to tell Mr McClelland about why cutting off a tag isn't a crime?
First Minister.
Well, can I firstly, again, as I have done previously, put on record my condolences to the McClelland family for everything they have gone through. And what I would say to Craig's father is this. At the time that happened, that dreadful tragedy and crime took place, the specific offence that we've put into law this week, the offence of being unlawfully at large, was not on the statute book. That case is one of the reasons why we considered this and decided to legislate this week to put that specific crime on the statute book. So I would say to families such as Craig McClelland's families and others who have suffered in these circumstances, this is a response specifically to that. The Justice Secretary has also taken other action to respond to what happened in that case, and of course issues and decisions about wider considerations of that case fall to the independent law officers to take. But it is precisely because of that that the change in the law was made this week, a change in the law that my party and my government voted for, a change in the law that Ruth Davidson's party voted against.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
To ask the First Minister how many government debates there have been on education policy in the parliamentary year which ends today.
First Minister.
Well, I don't have the number of government debates, but I do know earlier this week, John Swinney, the Education Secretary, made a statement on education reform. I remember, was it last week or the week before, he made a statement on attainment and assessment in primary schools. The Education Secretary and I spend, as you would expect, a considerable amount of our time making sure that we continue the progress of raising attainment in our schools and closing the attainment gap, making more progress than I believe was made under previous Labour administrations.
Richard Leonard.
Yes, we know that the Cabinet Secretary is happy to read out statements but not take interventions, not take part in a debate and not have a vote. Because the answer, Presiding Officer, to the question I asked is none. Not one. In the last parliamentary year, there have been no government debates on that top priority of education. In fact, there hasn't been one since as far back as the 2nd of November 2017. Or we've had ministerial statements, like this week's mercy killing of the education bill, but no debates. What is it that the government's so afraid of debating? Is it the teacher recruitment crisis? Is it the narrowing of the curriculum? Is it the explosion of multi-level teaching? Is it the growing crisis in additional support needs? Or is it, Presiding Officer, because when we do debate and then vote on this government's record on education, it is defeated in this Parliament?
First Minister.
Well, I guess Richard Leonard has a point, because we could have come to this chamber and we could have debated the 10% pay rise for teachers in our country. We could have debated the 500 more teachers in our schools this year.
Order, please, order.
The fact that we've got more teachers in primary schools now than at any time since 1980. The Education Secretary made a statement this week, he made a statement last week. It's really not my fault if Richard Leonard can't manage to ask questions on these statements. But do you know what? Do you know what? I'm really... Useless.
Order, please.
How many times had Richard Leonard come to this chamber and said that the single biggest thing we've got to do to raise attainment and close the poverty-related attainment gap in our schools is to tackle child
poverty. How many times in recent weeks has he come to this chamber and called on me to introduce an income supplement? And today, the day after, we introduce a £10 a week income supplement for the poorest families in our country to tackle child poverty and help us raise attainment. Richard Leonard has got nothing to say about it, which suggests that he's not particularly interested in children, he's only interested in the politics.
Richard Leonard.
Well, that was an astonishing answer, because I'll tell you what, the First Minister's claims on education don't bear examination. That's why the government dare not debate them. Consider this: if education is a government's top priority, it invests in it. So why is this government spending £427 less per pupil in our primary schools? And it's not just schools. Why does the Auditor General say that our colleges are not achieving financial sustainability? And if education really is your top priority, then why does research that we are publishing today show that since it came to office, the government is spending over £1,000 less per student on teaching in our universities? Isn't this the record on education that the government is so unwilling and unable to debate? It's a record of cuts. Cuts to our schools, cuts to colleges and cuts to Scotland's universities.
First Minister.
Unfortunately for Richard Leonard, the facts tell a very different story. There have been real terms increases in education by local councils in each of the last 2 years. There have been increases in the number of teachers in our schools in each of the last 3 years. We see the Pupil Equity Fund putting more money into the hands of head teachers in our schools, which is probably why we've got rising exam passes in our schools. We've got a record number of young people going into positive destinations. We've got a record number of young people from the poorest parts of our country going into higher education, including university. That's the record of this government in education, and we'll go on with the job of continuing to make that progress, and that is progress, Presiding Officer, that we are proud of.
Thank you. A few constituency supplementaries. The first from Jamie Halker-Johnson, followed by Bob Doris. Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. Murray Council has already endured millions of pounds worth of cuts to its budget as local government funding has been squeezed by the Scottish Government. And we've now heard from the SNP leader of Murray Council that they face another £19.3 million worth of cuts by 2021, with future budgets very challenging. So local people in Murray now face seeing more of their basic public services under threat and their council tax bills rising. So can I ask the First Minister, for how many more years will Murray have to endure local budget cuts at the hands of an SNP administration in Elgin, content to take another bad deal from their SNP colleagues here in Edinburgh?
First Minister.
I seem to remember recently the Conservatives resigned the administration of Murray Council because they wanted to implement cuts. This government has increased funding for local government. We will continue to protect and be fair to local government in all of the budgetary decisions that we make. But the last point I would make to the member is a point I have made many times over this session before, but I think it is worth making again. If we had followed in our budget the Tory proposals to give tax cuts to the richest in our country, our budget would be £550 million smaller than it is, and it would be local authorities that would pay the price of that. The Tories have got a cheek to come here and talk about budgets.
Bob Doris, to be followed by John Finney. Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, schools in Maryhill and Springburn and right across Scotland break up for the summer holidays. Holiday hunger will become a reality for too many children in Scotland. Glasgow City Council run a £2 million annual holiday hunger strategy where children can get involved in various free youth activities right across the city and, importantly, be provided with food free and without stigma. Would the First Minister urge families in Glasgow to check on the Council website and in local libraries for more information and activities available for children in their area? And does she agree with me that we must do all we can to tackle child poverty, not just out with term time, but all year round?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I very much welcome Glasgow City Council's efforts. Food insecurity during the school holidays is driven by family incomes being too low to meet their needs. That's why we continue to challenge the UK Government's punitive welfare cuts. It's why we have focused £2 million out of our £3.5 million Fair Food Fund specifically on school holidays. And of course, it's why we announced in this chamber yesterday bold action to tackle child poverty in Scotland. Over the past year alone, we have introduced the new Best Start grant, a financial health check service, and we have also increased school clothing grants. And of course, by the end of 2022, our new Scottish Child payment worth £10 a week will be available to all eligible children under 16, and we will deliver early payments for under 6s before the end of this Parliament.
And John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, in order for young people to realise their potential, we must provide them with a good quality learning environment. This week we've been told that the budget to upgrade crumbling school buildings in the Highlands has been cut by a third. The Highland Council say this is because they received £25 million less than expected from the Scottish Government. First Minister, this is clearly a matter of huge concern to parents, teachers and pupils, not least those associated with the substandard St Clement's School for those with additional needs, which wasn't even on the list for replacement. Can the First Minister tell me why this has happened? And will the First Minister please ask the Education Secretary to meet with me so that we can seek resolution to this concerning matter?
First Minister.
I'm sure the Education Secretary would be more than happy to discuss these issues with John Finney. In terms of the capital budget for local authorities, we've increased capital funding for local authorities. We've also funded additional school projects over and above that. And of course, as I've said a moment ago, we continue to treat local government fairly within a very tight financial situation, and we will continue to do so. And I think it's partly because it is recognised that we've treated local government as fairly as we possibly can, that we had the Green support for our budget earlier this year.
Thank you. Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Earlier this month, some 40 members of the teaching staff at Glasgow Kelvin College were told that their contracts would be terminated tomorrow. None of the staff or union representatives knew this was coming. One of the lecturers affected has written to me to say, "My confidence in the college has been completely eroded. These redundancies will taint the learning and teaching experience for the new cohort of students we're due to receive in August. The overall impact of these changes is a blow to the working class communities we serve in our college." Come August, there will be over 3,000 students who've already enrolled in courses that now may not have the staff in place to teach them. Does the First Minister think this is an acceptable way to treat our college lecturers and their students?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, as Patrick Harvey knows, colleges operate independently of government. They have responsibility for their own staffing provision, and these are operational matters for individual colleges. However, I would expect colleges, like I would expect all employers, to engage meaningfully with trade unions and to treat staff fairly. It is, of course, incumbent on colleges to make sure that they can staff courses properly. We invest heavily in our colleges. We have met and, in fact, exceeded the commitment we made in terms of student numbers at our colleges. And, of course, there has just, I'm pleased to say, been an agreement around a pay rise for college lecturers as well, which I hope is a sign of how much the contribution they make in our society is valued.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm glad the First Minister says that we should expect better treatment from all employers. But these are not some part of the private sector that we cannot regulate. These are public services, and the Scottish Government funds and regulates this sector. Under the terms of the National Agreement, many of these lecturers should have been moving on to permanent contracts. This is a cynical move by the college management, and it will prevent those lecturers from achieving their 2 years' service. Put courses at risk, and ultimately it will be students who pay the price. The Scottish Government has a fair work agenda, but the use of casual contracts like this in the college sector means that they can be terminated at a moment's notice, and it's far from unique to Glasgow Kelvin College. The unions EIS, the Further Education Lecturers Association and UCU consider the use of these casual contracts to be endemic across the higher and further education sectors. Workers' rights are being eroded and students will pay the price. Does the Scottish Government accept that it has a responsibility to review the use of these contracts across the further education sector as a matter of urgency?
First Minister. Well, can I say to Patrick Harvey, in general terms, I do agree with and have a great deal of sympathy for his comments about casual contracts more generally across the economy. I also strongly endorse the comments made about fair work. I'm very happy to undertake that the Deputy First Minister will raise these concerns with the colleges sector. However, as I said a moment ago, these are operational matters for individual colleges. The responsibility of the Government is to ensure that we fund our colleges, and as Audit Scotland has said, the Scottish Government has been providing colleges with real terms increases in revenue funding since 2016-17. So colleges are expected to plan and manage their activities within the budgets that we give to them. But I'm very happy to ask the Education Secretary to raise the concerns that Patrick Harvey has raised about the use of casual contracts with the colleges sector, and I'm sure he'd be happy to report back when he's done so.
Thank you. Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
The number of suicides was steadily going down, but last year it was its highest for 5 years. For young people, deaths from suicide are up 50%. Mental health services can't cope. 3,000 people waited over a year for treatment. The police can't cope. The Chief Constable says police are picking up when other services fail. Prisons can't cope. The parents of Katie Allen blame the culture. What we are currently doing is just not enough. So what more will the First Minister do to stop suicides from rising again next year?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Willie Rennie for raising this issue. The statistics that were published this week on suicides are of course of concern, not just to me and to the Government, but of concern to everybody across our society. There is still a longer downwards trend in suicide, but that is of no comfort to anybody whose life has been touched by suicide, and as I'm sure everybody would agree, one suicide is one too many. So this is something that the Government takes very seriously. We've recently established the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group, which is chaired by the former Deputy Chief Constable Rose Fitzpatrick. The Suicide Prevention Action Plan was published last year and sets out a range of actions that we are taking. In terms of the broader mental health question, of course we have a situation where more people are presenting for help with mental health, and that's something we encourage as the stigma reduces. But we need to do two things, and we are working through additional investment and a range of other initiatives to do these things. Firstly, to make sure that the services are there in specialist mental health provision for people who need it, but also to make sure that we are shifting the balance of care much more towards prevention. That's particularly important, I think, with young people, which is why we have made and are currently implementing the commitments around more school counsellors and the plans for a new mental wellbeing service for those in the 5 to 24 age group. So this is an important area and one where the Government is and will continue to take a range of actions.
Willie Rennie.
Thank the First Minister for that answer. I have been warning her for years about this important subject. I'm not going to rehearse the arguments on delayed strategies, because it breaks my heart to hear the families talk about their loss and how it affects communities like my own in Kelty, where there's been a spate of suicides just in the last month. In this Parliament, we all have a responsibility to care. We need to reach out to those struggling, to ask about their health. But the First Minister has a special responsibility. Today, SAMH report that 5,000 children have been rejected from mental health services. No one should be turned away. The mental health charity has called for the Government to immediately implement all 29 recommendations that they promised to deliver. Will she do that?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I agree with Willie Rennie's point about all of us having a responsibility, but as First Minister I have a particular responsibility. And let me say, in all sincerity, to Willie Rennie, nobody feels that responsibility more than I do, and it's one I take very seriously indeed. I've set out the actions we are taking around suicide and mental health. In particular, the question has been raised about the SAMH report today about rejected referrals. Of course, we will take forward the recommendations that are made in that report. We, of course, had a review, the audit of rejected referrals, which reported some months ago. One of the outcomes of that, of course, was the establishment of the Children and Young People's Task Force. I understand the task force itself will publish a set of recommendations next week, and we look forward to receiving that. And amongst other things, these recommendations will help inform the development of the community mental health wellbeing service that I spoke about in my earlier answer. So we work closely with organisations like SAMH. We always take seriously what they say, and we always take seriously the recommendations they make, and that will be the case for the report that they have published today.
Thank you. We've got some further supplementaries. The first from Graham Simpson, to be followed by Sandra White. Graham Simpson.
Thank you. The annual government statistics on homelessness came out this week, and they make for pretty grim reading. Homelessness has gone up across almost every indicator in the last year. There's been a 3% rise in homeless applications. The number of homeless children has risen for the 5th year in a row. Every 17.5 minutes, a household was made homeless in Scotland. Shelter Scotland say that thousands of men, women and children are being denied their most basic right to a safe home on an industrial scale. So my question for the First Minister is, how much longer is she prepared to tolerate this?
First Minister.
Well, any rise in homelessness is unacceptable, and again, I am very concerned by the statistics that are published this week. Again, the long-term trend in homelessness applications is down, but the recent increase is one, of course, that we take seriously. The figures that were published this week, of course, largely predate the publication of our Ending Homelessness Action Plan. That was published in November, and these statistics cover the year 2018 to 19. So the range of actions that we have set out there are about making sure that we tackle homelessness and rough sleeping, backed, of course, by the £50 million of investment. But can I just say to the member, everybody who knows anything about this knows why homelessness applications are increasing. The member may not want to take my word for it, so I'm going to quote the UN Special Rapporteur on poverty. And the Tories might do well to listen to this, because what he said is this, and it was in his statement specifically on Wales, but it has wider applicability. There is wide consensus among stakeholders that benefit changes are one of the structural causes behind the increase in poverty, rough sleeping and homelessness. We've also seen local authorities say that, in their view, it's welfare cuts that, and again I'm quoting here from the Crisis Homelessness Monitor report, it is welfare cuts that has exacerbated homelessness, and almost all also acknowledge that the impacts had been mitigated by the Scottish Government. So we will do everything within our power to tackle homelessness, but can I say to the member and to every Tory in this chamber, rather than coming here and asking the Scottish Government to take more action to mitigate the actions of its own government at Westminster, it would fit it better if it made a case to its Tory government in Westminster to stop these cuts altogether.
Sandra White, to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First Minister, today money starts arriving in claimants' bank accounts in Glasgow, particularly principally women who worked for Labour-controlled run Glasgow City Council, which discriminated against them by paying them less because of their gender. Will the First Minister join with me and welcome this huge step towards righting this historic wrong, and will she extend her thanks to those who have fought hard for this very fair deal?
First Minister.
Well, I am absolutely delighted that as of today, women in Glasgow, including many of my own constituents, will start to get the money that they were denied for years and years and years. This is a historic wrong. It is a historic wrong that past administrations of Glasgow City Council failed to put right. And I am extremely proud that this SNP administration in Glasgow has righted that wrong, and as of today is delivering justice to the women who have been denied it for so long. And let me put on record my pride, particularly in Susan Aitken, who from the minute she was elected leader of Glasgow City Council has made this a priority. And I think the women take principal credit for the campaigns that they have waged, but I think Susan Aitken, as leader of Glasgow City Council, deserves a lot of credit for this as well.
Maurice Corrie, followed by Elaine Smith. Maurice Corrie.
Presiding officer, this week has been Armed Forces Week, and in Parliament this week we've seen Glasgow's Helping Heroes here, one of many organisations that do so much to help our armed forces personnel and veterans. Will the First Minister join me and many others in appreciating the work which our armed forces personnel do for our country, and also the work of many organisations that do so much to support those who protect us and our veterans as well?
First Minister.
Yes, I absolutely am happy to join with the member in saying a heartfelt thank you to all of our armed forces, to those who work so hard and often sacrifice so much to keep the rest of us safe. I would also put on record again, as I have many times before, my thanks to our veterans. We owe a great debt of gratitude and also a great responsibility to our veterans. As the member says, there are many organisations that do great work to support our veterans. Let me just name one in particular, a company, Scotland's bravest manufacturing company, that I visited just a couple of weeks ago, that employs veterans to make signs. They, like many other organisations like them, are doing fantastic work, and we should support them as they do so.
Elaine Smith, to be followed by Keith Brown. Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I supported Nicola Sturgeon's decision as Health Secretary in 2007 to stop the downgrading of Monkland's A&E. But now today, her Health Secretary has taken a decision to close the whole hospital on its current site. The people of Airdrie and Coatbridge need our hospital in the heart of our community. So will the First Minister order a rethink of this shocking decision taken just as we are going into recess?
First Minister.
Well, I'm not sure if the member listened to what the Health Secretary said just before First Minister's questions started. Can I say the member did support my decision to save Monkland's Accident and Emergency from closure. I have to say also, though, if it had been down to her party, there would be no A&E in Monkland's, and who knows, there might have been no Monkland's Hospital by now. The member is just wrong in what she is saying. There is an absolute commitment on the part of this government to see a replacement hospital for Monkland's Hospital built, which will include A&E services, incidentally. An independent review panel has put forward recommendations around the site. The issues with the current site is that there is not enough room on the current site to build a new hospital. It would require demolition of the existing hospital and raise lots of issues around patient safety. She cited the Queen Elizabeth and the Southern General. The Southern General was able to continue operating while the Queen Elizabeth was being built. That would not be possible on the Monkland's site. So what the Health Secretary has said to NHS Lanarkshire is that they must continue consultation on a range of options, including options that have come forward more recently. So not only has this government saved A&E services in Monkland's Hospital, it is this government that will make sure there is a replacement from Monkland's Hospital serving those communities well into the future. I'm not sure any of that would have happened had Labour still been on these benches.
Keith Brown.
In light of the reports today that the couple who did their civic duty and reported the domestic disturbance in the Boris Johnson flat have now had to move out and require security assistance, and in light of the fact that the latest victim of Ruth Davidson's endorsement, Jeremy Hunt, has admitted that the Tory government have gone far too far in cutting police numbers, in contrast to the SNP government in Scotland, does she agree with me that the Tories in this chamber are guilty of almost criminal hypocrisy?
First Minister, I don't think... First Minister, I appreciate the question. I don't think that any of that's a matter for the First Minister's responsibilities. We'll move on to question. We can tell it's the last day of term. We'll move on to a real question from Stuart McMillan. Stuart McMillan, question number 5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister, in light of the Heriot-Watt University report, Hard Edges Scotland, what the Scottish Government is doing to improve the general well-being of adults.
First Minister.
We welcome the publication of the Hard Edges Scotland study, which is an important contribution to understanding how we can better support those with complex needs facing severe and multiple disadvantage. The study adds further support for the Scottish Government's preventative approach, which aims to ensure services reach people earlier to better address mental ill health, substance use, homelessness or issues in life after prison. Our recent mental health, alcohol and drug and homelessness strategies, as well as our focus on adverse childhood experiences and child poverty, show how we are putting both adults and children's general well-being at the centre of our work. And the voice of lived experience is a key part of the study, and public services need to put that experience at the centre of their collective response.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the First Minister for that reply. And the First Minister will be aware of the challenges in my own constituency regarding poverty and drug use. And the report notes that while many people face multiple problems, services are often set up to address single issues. Does the First Minister agree with me that we should be looking to strengthen more services like Ideas in my constituency, who have a person-centred and cross-agency approach to help adults with the support they require, which will become even more important if a no-deal Brexit hits the economy and the cost of living increases?
First Minister.
Yes, I agree very much with that. Treatment and support services must address the wider needs that people have, such as poor mental health, poverty, isolation, employability and homelessness, and the Hard Edges study confirms this. We are absolutely committed to tackling poverty in Scotland. In 2019-20, we will continue to invest over £125 million to mitigate the worst impacts of welfare cuts and to support those on low incomes. And yesterday in the Chamber we laid our first annual progress report setting out the steps we have taken and the further steps we will take. But there is no doubt, and Stuart McMillan is absolutely right to raise this, that the prospect of Brexit, in particular the potential for a no-deal Brexit, exacerbates all of these issues, which is why it is beyond my comprehension that the contenders for the Tory leadership are prepared to contemplate that catastrophic outcome. And it shows just how out of touch on this and on so much else the Tories are with opinion in Scotland.
Question number 6, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to ensure that parents have access to clear and accurate information about childhood vaccination programmes.
First Minister.
It's very important that clear and accurate information is made available to those consenting to vaccinations, either for themselves or on behalf of a child. NHS Scotland provides a wide range of information on vaccinations on its websites. Parents and carers are provided with an information pack ahead of scheduled vaccination sessions to ensure that they have access to the information they need. In Scotland, uptake of the first dose of the MMR vaccine in children up to age 5 has remained above the 95% target since 2009. However, we are not complacent and will continue to make every effort to promote and encourage childhood vaccinations.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer? Research suggests that levels of vaccination tend to be lower among people from less affluent or rural areas. NHS Scotland's Vaccination Transformation Programme identifies a number of possible interventions to address this, including providing greater access to vaccinations in a non-clinical setting. Can the First Minister confirm whether the Scottish Government supports this and how it will support that implementation?
First Minister.
Yes, we do support making sure that access is as easy as possible, particularly for those in deprived communities. In fact, our whole health service strategy is about making sure that there is good access to health services for those living in our poorer communities and those living in rural communities as well. That is certainly the case in terms of vaccinations. I think it is important to stress, as I did a moment ago, that childhood immunisation rates across Scotland remain very high. We want it to stay that way, so we will continue to look at the information we give and the practical arrangements we can put in place to ensure that those rates remain as high as they are and indeed get higher in the future.
And question number 7, James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister for what reason the 2018-19 Scottish budget was underspent by £449 million.
First Minister.
The Finance Secretary provided a full statement and a detailed briefing paper to members on the 20th of June explaining the 2018-19 provisional outturn position. Under the current devolution settlement, of course, the Scottish Parliament is not permitted to overspend its budget, and I don't think it takes too much consideration to understand why we need to plan carefully to make sure that we don't do that.
The underspend, which is part of careful management, represents a tiny fraction of our overall budget, and it is carried forward in full through the Scottish Reserve, with most of it supporting the 2019-20 Scottish Budget. The position also enables us to increase our reserves to ensure we can respond to future challenges like Brexit, for example, and of course every single penny of any underspend is used to support public services in Scotland. And I have to point out that that is in stark contrast to the Labour-led Scottish Executive, which between 1999 and 2007 returned a total of £1.5 billion to the UK Treasury because they couldn't work out how to spend it.
James Kelly.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Last week, the First Minister told Parliament that every penny in the Scottish budget was accounted for. What she didn't tell us, and what we know now, is that nearly £500 million was being kept back in a Scottish Government slush fund. I agreed with Nicola Sturgeon previously.
Order, please.
I agreed with Nicola Sturgeon previously when she said that the Tory two-child benefit cap was abhorrent. Can I ask the First Minister, therefore, why the Government did not allocate £69 million in the 1920 budget from the £449 million underspend to cancel this horrendous Tory policy?
First Minister.
Do you know, I'm really sorry to say this, but I actually feel quite embarrassed for James Kelly right now. After so many years in this Parliament, that he doesn't even have a basic grasp of the basic principles of government and budgeting is really quite staggering. Let me try and explain it. Let me try and explain it simply to James Kelly. Every penny of the underspend, as he describes it, that can be allocated is already allocated in the Scottish Budget for this year. Not a penny of it goes back to the Treasury. And yes, we put some of it into reserves. I think that's common sense. What if we have a major flooding incident? What if we have to respond to Brexit, as we undoubtedly will? It is common sense budgeting. And let me leave James Kelly with two final things to ponder over the summer recess. The first I've already mentioned, the £1.5 billion that the last Labour government gave back to the Treasury. But secondly, this fact, the total cash underspend that was reported this week is 0.9% of our budget. That compares in the last year to 1.1%, so it's down. But take the 1.1%, that is compares to the Labour Party in Wales in the same year, where the underspend here was 1.1%. In Wales, it was 2.1%. Because they, like us, know that they've got to budget sensibly. And I have to say, all James Kelly has done today is demonstrate why fewer and fewer and fewer people in Scotland ever want to see the Labour Party sitting in government on these benches.
And Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank you, Presiding Officer. So as well as a £449 million underspend, the Scottish Government has got a looming £1 billion black hole in its budget, according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Now, yesterday, the Fraser of Allender Institute told us that the Scottish Government's £500 million tax raid on hard-working Scottish families will not deliver one extra penny for the Scottish public services because all of that money disappears into the black hole. The Finance Secretary doesn't have a clue what to do about this problem. Does the First Minister?
First Minister.
Well, do you know, Presiding Officer, I know we're about to break for the summer recess, but I have to say, when I get James Kelly followed by Murdo Fraser, it feels more like Christmas than summer to me. So, what a tremendous way to end the session. There is no black hole in the Scottish budget, as anybody who understands the figures
and what the Scottish Fiscal Commission actually says would know. But let me tell you what would put a black hole in the Scottish budget. Tory tax cuts for the richest in our society, costing £550 million. That's what would put a black hole in the Scottish budget, which is why, presiding officer, fewer and fewer people in Scotland want to see the Tories on these benches in government as well.
Thank you very much. That concludes First Minister's questions. There are no questions to be put as a result of today's business, so I close this meeting and I'll see you all on Saturday. Enjoy the recess.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.